Hello everyone, my name is Susi Ferrarello and I'm going to be your instructor for this quarter on ethics in psychological research. If you have questions or doubts, you can write to me at susi.ferrarello@gmail.com. I will attach to this video also a few slides just in case you have doubts or concerns on the spelling of certain names or terms. Now, with this video, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we are going to do during this quarter. Basically, I'm going to investigate into the connections between ethics and psychology in order to understand whether it's ethics to influence psychology and to provide the ground for psychological research for what we consider normal or abnormal, or if it's psychology that gives ethics the empirical description for the correct behavior. So if psychology provides ethics with the data that are necessary to describe what's the acceptable behavior, what's the acceptable rule in order to live in an harmonious society. So basically we are going to examine the boundaries between these two disciplines. And since ethics and psychology are huge fields of research, I decided to limit our analysis to normative ethics. As you will know, with this class, ethics is divided into three big groups. And of course, it's an arbitrary division. It's a way that scholars used to organize their study on ethics. These three big groups are descriptive ethics, meta-ethics, and normative ethics. Now, descriptive ethics is of course, a form of ethics that has to do with the description of the ethical experience. We are not actually doing ethics in descriptive ethics because we observe what ethics is, without even saying what ethics should be. We limit ourselves to be observators of the ethical truth, reality, experience that is unfolding in front of us. In this case, descriptive ethics is particularly important for psychology, sociology, anthropology, and so forth, because it gives a description of the ethical lived experience from different points of view that can interest different disciplines. And this is the first school, the first group, I would say, more than school. The second group is the group that we called meta-ethics. Now, meta is a preposition in Greek that means beyond. So this suffix in general indicates all that is beyond the name in front of it, in front of which it is posed. So meta-ethics is that group in which we are going to examine what makes ethics ethics. Meta-ethics is that field that examines the tools that we need to use in order to do ethics. So in this field we might investigate the usefulness of ethics for our life. So we might ask questions like why should we be ethical? Why should I behave? What do I gain from being an ethical person? This could be one group of questions that we examine in meta-ethics. Plus, meta-ethics is a group in which we organize ethics that might rule out the other two groups. Some scholars, in fact, consider metaethics the only ethical that is possible to do, because ethics is something that has to do with actions, with practice. So when we work on ethics, we can't work on something that we think is fine, because ethics is something that has to do with what we do more than what we think. So some scholars consider meta-ethics the reflection on what makes ethics possible, the only possible ethics. Now, the third group is the group on which this class will be focused. Normative ethics. Normative ethics is that a category of ethical researches that strive to find a definition of the norms, rules that can make our life harmonious, acceptable, good. So normative ethics, as the name shows, is that forms of ethics that reflect on norms, on those norms on which we built a definition of normality. And here we can see how our class entangles with psychology. Because when a client comes in our office, necessarily the client will will bring along a definition of normality that he or she gives implied. On the other hand, we have our own definition of normality. In both cases, what we define normal is built on an ethical stance, on a number of norms and rules that tell us what is normal and what is not. So I think it might be helpful to find a way to reflect on what normality is from a psychological and an ethical point of view. And normative ethics is that kind of ethics that theoretically, that from a theoretical point of view, built a definition of normality. So in this class we are going to reflect on three schools that belong to this big group. Normative ethics, in fact, is a category that contains many other tiny schools, many other tiny categories, and in this class we're going to examine three big schools that belong to this chunk of ethics. And these schools are Deontological Ethics, Consequentialist Ethics, and Virtue Character Ethics. Now, Deontological ethics is that ethics that considers our good behavior as based on what is deon. Now, deon is a Greek word to say duty. So, according to deontological ethics, a behavior, an action, a desire is good not on the basis of a moral choice, but on the basis of a duty, an obligation. Now, the word deon in Greek is a word that means duty, and this duty is strictly connected to necessity. It's a rich word, deon, because it comes from the verb dei, which means it is necessary. So deon expresses that obligation that we feel necessary to fulfill in order to feel fine with ourselves, in order to live better. So, the definition of good from a deontological position does not imply necessarily something that is always morally good or that is always right. This duty, this obligation is a conditio sine qua non for us to be good, to feel fine, to have a compass that orient ourselves towards something that is correct. So, deontological ethics is based on an a priori condition that allows us to be good persons. Deontology, in fact, in our professional life, indicates those set of rules we need to stick by in order to not get sued, hopefully, in order to be good professionals, in order to help people. And these rules are not set while we are doing our professions, but are a number of principles we have to be acquainted with before we start working, because they will define our professionality. This is deontological ethics. And we'll study, for example, Kantian ethics when we will work on deontological ethics. Consequentialist ethics is completely different. As the term says, consequentialist ethics is all focused on the consequences of our actions. So even if we are going to do something that is based on a rule that we consider absolutely correct and fine, even if we are acting on this basis, but the consequences are bad, the consequences of our actions are ineffective or even harmful for the majority of people, then what we did was wrong. An example is Nazism, we might say. So obey to the law settled by our government might be considered from a deontological perspective the duty of every good citizen. Fine. The problem is that when your government tells you to obey to a law according to which you have to report to the police your neighbor because your neighbor is Jewish or is gypsy or is crippled and so on, then maybe this is not exactly the right thing to do. So, consequentialist ethics consider norms as based on the positive effects that your action is going to give on the largest number of people. The definition of normality, according to a consequentialist ethics, is completely different from the definition of normality that we might have with deontological ethics. And it is possible that our definition of normality involves both of them at the same time, but then we might create we might live in not a coherent system, and we might describe either in our research or in our practice a definition of well-being that is somehow incoherent, problematic, and cannot work in our daily life. So, reflecting on the definition of normality and better on the ethical implications that are involved in the definition of normality can be helpful to gain more awareness in our daily life and in our research, in our scholarly research. Now, the third group of normative ethics that we are going to examine in this class is virtue character ethics. Virtue character ethics says that actually is not important to the definition of a good person, to the definition of a good deed or principle. It's not important what the premises are or the consequences are. What is important is my character. If I'm a good person, meaning, if I decide to cultivate those traits that are going to influence my system, what is around me in a positive way, then maybe I'm going to do something good. So the definition of good is fully based on my traits, on my character. Again, we'll see what are the pros and the cons of this school as well. Last piece to conclude the introduction of this class. All these three schools, all these three normative schools might lead to a form of personality disorder or psychological disimbalance that is either implied in the ethical position or it might be the consequence of a super coherent way to take this ethical stance. So, for example, the definition of good that is proposed by the Deontological Ethics might involve a narcissistic character because once I decide what is good according to my premises, according to my point of view, and I pretend that these premises and these points of view is universal, then maybe I might be blind to the needs of other people. I might consider this deon, this duty, which is my duty, as something that deletes the image of others and puts my image, puts my will, my freedom on a pedestal. At least this is something that some studies showed, and we are going to examine these studies during our quarter. Then the second position is the position that consequentialism take, and it's the second school we mentioned. Now, this position might be a position that psychopaths loved or are going to love. Because, as we know, this kind of personality disorder tends to bend the moral rules to the needs of the person who suffers from that disorder. So psychopaths most of the time feel above the rules, and they tend to justify what they're doing on the basis of the consequences of the goals they want to achieve. So this kind of ethical stance might depict a definition of normality and goodness that fits in a psychopathic society. It is worthwhile to examine this point, I think. Then the third stance, virtue ethics theory. This school is another interesting stance that ethics took since ancient Greece. So Aristotle, Plato are those that cultivate this position more than a fixed idea of what is good. But it is true at the same time that what we decide to cultivate is based on the blame or the praises that the system in which we are put on us once we show our character. So our character is fully shaped by the feedbacks that we receive in in the system in which we live, which means that we might experience some kind of progressive detachment from our needs, our feelings, and our real traits. So it might be that, as Lang, for example, showed, our character can go through personality disorders like hysteria or schizophrenia, or a sort of engulfment, collapse of our personality. So it might be interesting to examine how this definition of goodness and normality can lead to this point of alienation. So what are again the psychological pros and cons of this ethical stance? Now, this is it. This is more or less what we're going to do during this quarter. We are going to examine the connection between ethics and psychology. We're going to study normative ethics, which is a part of ethics that is different from descriptive ethics and meta-ethics. And inside normative ethics, we're going to examine three schools: Deontological Ethics, Consequentialist Ethics, and Virtue Character Ethics. And we're going to see how these ethical stances inform a certain definition of normality that we take for granted in our daily psychological balance or in the researches, the scholarly researches we might do in our work, or we might put in practice if we work with people, whether we are teachers or social workers or psychotherapists. So this is what we are going to examine during this quarter. If you have questions, you can find me on Canvas or at susie.ferrarello@gmail.com. Thanks. Bye.